After more than a year of a world upended, people are heading back to in-person work. Will the workplace look the same? Or in this moment, should we question the rules and invent a better way of working? Author Francesca Gino believes the time is right for constructive rebels who think creatively and defy the status quo. Curiosity and authenticity are among the traits that lead to success, according to the author of Rebel Talent, Why It Pays to Break the Rules at Work and in Life. In her book, the Harvard Business School professor describes how rebels can change the world for the better.
It is the perfect time to embrace this way of being a constructive rebel, suggesting ideas, being more open to the ideas of others.
From a Michelin-starred restaurant in Italy to a typewriter company that pioneered a computer revolution, to the creativity behind Disney and Pixar, Gino cites real examples of how unconventional thinking leads to unanticipated success. Joining Gino in conversation is Ed Catmull, co-founder of Pixar and former president of Pixar and Disney Animation Studios. Francesca Gino, author of Rebel Talent, Why It Pays to Break the Rules at Work and in Life, and Ed Catmull, co-founder of Pixar and former president of Disney. It's great to have you both here. I'm very excited about this conversation.
Thank you so much for having us.
It's a real pleasure to be here.
I was just thinking about what a timely book this is, and I wanted to see if you wanted to talk a little bit about just why it is you want to kind of reignite the conversation about this book right now as we come back to working again after maybe in person after the pandemic. I heard a statistic that maybe 60% of people are looking for a new job or thinking of changing careers. So I wanted to see if you two wanted to address what the need is for thinking a little differently right now about work.
Both of us have actually thought a lot, even if in different ways, how is it that you can fuel creative ways of thinking, which seems particularly needed at a time where there is in fact change and people are thinking not only to adapt to the current environment, but also designing the next chapter. And so I thought a lot about how some of the lessons and insights from Rebel Talent could be helpful to people as they think about embracing change. One that to me stands out is curiosity. Curiosity has actually helped people even over the last 15 months to feel more energy out of their work. For many people, or at least this comes from our data, the relationship with work has changed and often has been in decline. So if you look at job satisfaction, work engagement, for many people across the United States, has been in decline, but what has helped people buffer against that decline is having a curious mindset. So thinking about this situation of crisis as an opportunity to do things differently, asking a lot of why questions. Maybe there were ways of working that became part of my routine. I was almost complacent. Let's rethink about what's next. And so I feel that having this type of mindset or rebellious attitude, if you will, can be truly helpful in this moment of change.
Ed, I feel like you know a lot about creativity in the workplace.
Well, I've thought somewhat about it. The interesting thing about the pandemic is that the tools that we had for communicating remotely were slowly developing. We learned that there are some things that are actually better off done this way. You can get into something faster. Then there were a lot of things where the workarounds worked okay. It may not be great. We could get around it. Somewhat coasting on pre-existing relationships. So we could also say, oh, after a year, some of the relationships are weakening because we don't have the direct contact. So whatever lessons we learned still haven't settled in yet. And then we learned there are certain things that actually are flaming disaster. like senior year for high school students is a disaster wherever you are. There's something about the social bond which we took for granted. It was important, but without it, it was very damaging that the people missed out on that. Okay, now we're coming out of this. What do we do with it? So you have a lot of people and companies questioning what it is they do, how they work, what's effective. A lot of times things happen because of unexpected surprises or events. So it's like when Sputnik was launched, all right, traumatic effect, major impact in the world. But and it's a clear existential threat. When Netscape came out with a browser, Microsoft recognized it was an existential threat, and it resulted in a whole bunch of changes. Or when Apple came out with the iPhone, Google recognized that if Apple controlled everything about the communication through the phone, that they would be screwed. In that response, neither of them predicted that there was going to be an outcome of this app revolution. The apps, the unpredicted part of this was a fundamental world cultural transition point. All right, didn't see it. That's kind of the story of our lives. So the way I look at it is in any organization, and you want your organization to be creative, then sometimes you have to put yourself in the impossible position. And we've done that. We've picked projects, we've made movies where you say, okay, that can't possibly work. And that's when the best stuff happens. You have to be smart about it, but but the general case is people try to be conservative about it, and that's not a creative response.
Well, Francesca, the chapter in your book where Pixar is featured is about engagement, which is a really interesting thing. It's like, how are you going to engage, now? Are you going to engage differently? And are people going to be still engaging over video and Zoom and so on?
So I think that is left to be seen. What I'm hoping, and it varies based on conversations that I've had with different leaders across organizations, but what I'm hoping is that, as Ed was saying, there have been a lot of learning happening, and people often realize that they can be more agile or more creative. So I hear too many leaders talking about plans that are very ambiguous, that maybe allow for flexibility, but without more guidelines on how to be intentional, so that the type of sparks that usually happen when we are going for coffee or lunch together can in fact happen. So I'm hoping for two things: more intentionality in the decisions that we make as we design the next chapter, but also that we don't forget about what we've learned, because we have that nostalgia of what you used to be, and we want to run back to our previous life.
Well, speaking of that, Ed, at Pixar, you were very conscious of the fact that you needed to have engagement, and it was a transformative thing there. And you mentioned a few moments ago the brain trust, and there was also Notes Day with the employees. Can you tell us a little bit about that and what that was and how that worked?
One of the things to note, coming back to what Francesca said, and that is the intentionality. I believe you start off with a premise that you do have some experience, a number of things, you build on them, and about half of what you think is probably wrong. So if that's the case, and I think it is, I mean, a lot of leaders say that it's wrong, but they don't really believe it. They believe their job is to be right. And I don't. I think the job is to figure out what's working and what isn't working, and to adapt to it. And if you aren't wrong roughly half the time, and I include small wrongs as part of that too, but if you're not, then you're not actually thinking about it, right? You're actually jumping to a conclusion or an end which isn't justified. Brain trust itself, for instance, started off with 6 people who were particularly good at storytelling, and they each had different strengths. They were very open and honest with each other, and it was a very powerful group. But in fact, it evolved over time. And it evolved into really a way that we ran a meeting, because the attendees in the meetings is actually different all the time. There isn't a group called the Brain Trust. There was when we first started, but there isn't anymore, because we learned what were the things that were in fact valuable. And they had to do with making that room a safe place to come up with ideas or to address problems. And providing safety is very difficult. People have insecurities. They may feel like they're being judged. They don't want to look stupid. They don't want to offend somebody else. They don't want to take all the airtime, or they want to be in charge. I mean, there are all sorts of things that get in the way of genuine creative environment. But if you get the rules right, you take the power out of the room, and you enable people to throw out ideas. And if the ideas aren't accepted, that they don't become attached to them, right? That if you can actually throw out ideas and it's okay if the idea doesn't work, then you reach a higher level. But getting to that point is difficult. In the case of Pixar and Disney, there were two different personalities in these two different groups. One is called the Story Trust, the other is called the Brain Trust. But it was the same thing. It was, what's the intentionality of how we make it safe, and how do we get the right people to contribute to it?
Francesca, you talked about in that example how there was something called, I think Notes Day is what it was called, where it was, people like not top management, but just general employees, and they had the safety of not having, a safe sharing. Managers were excluded. Can you guys talk about that? And it's a counter, like so many of the concepts in your book, it sounds counterintuitive, but when you think about it, it makes perfect sense.
It's one of the examples that attracted me to the organization and inspired me to write and learn more about Ed as a leader, is the fact that it's so easy for us, especially when we have a lot of expertise under our belt, to just sit with what we know. We get complacent. We have arrived. And what I have learned by spending time with Ed is that that's not the case for him. It reminded me of an interesting model of another leader who I admire from a totally different context, who's a chef of a 3 Michelin star restaurant that in 2016 became the best restaurant in the world. His name is Massimo Bottura, and he always says that traditions are well-received experiments, but they're built to be rebuilt. And so there is this sense of desire of evolution, and something that should be part of our goals rather than just standing with what is comfortable and what we know.
So Notes Day was a single day, but there was a lead up to it, and there was a follow-up. The actual event that took place is we had an offsite with the leaders of the company, and one of the leaders, Guido from Italy, said, we have Brain Trust where we give notes to each other. What if the whole company spent a day just giving notes about how we run the company? So we had some of those leaders organize it. And as Francesca pointed out, the leaders themselves during Notes Day had their own sessions together, because we didn't want to have the people with the perceived authority to make decisions, even if they're very well liked. It doesn't matter. That's not the issue. Mm-hmm. The issue is you want to remove that dynamic of power from the room and have people come up with their ideas. And then we had thousands of notes, many of which were immediately put into play, some of which were minor, some which we didn't know what to do with them. It was this whole mixture. So we organized something that didn't include the leaders to try to surface problems, and then bringing the problems to Jim Morris and I. Jim was the general manager, and is now my successor at Pixar. And the information was not of great value. It was all stuff that we knew. So we went at this for 8 months, trying to figure out, okay, there's something important here. We're not actually getting it. And Jim Morris had a brilliant idea, and that was that we don't have them meet as a group, because all they were doing was sanding down the differences and leaving us with the stuff that was obvious. So instead, we met with them as individual departments, because now we could see what the differences were. Some of the things were easy to fix, some were very hard. but they were truthful and they came from the position of caring. And that's where we got the biggest transformations out as a result of Notes Day.
You talk about Scott Cook, CEO of Intuit, who actually requested a performance review, which is a very unusual thing for a CEO to do. Could we talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So as human beings, we have the wrong understanding of the power of authenticity. We think that covering up or that going along is what we should be doing because that buys us acceptance from the group. And what we fail to see instead is that we reach better outcomes if we're authentic. So this is one of the talents where I went deep with the research and looked at its effect across contexts. So you can go to entrepreneurs. What we find is that when entrepreneurs are more authentic or genuine in their pitching, they're also 3 times more likely to get money for their ventures. Or in interviews, when people are more authentic and they actually answer questions like, what is one of your weaknesses? Rather than saying, I'm too much of a perfectionist, they're actually genuine in their answers. They're more likely to get the job. And so there are all situations where bringing out our contribution, our ideas, our preferences, showing who we are ends up being the right answer in terms of how much satisfaction we get from our job, how much creativity we bring to the table, and how much we persevere in the face of challenges. Authenticity is not something that comes with a certain level, depending on where you sit in the organization, but it's something that we can all embrace, but again, requires learning.
What have you found with that in your career, Ed, the need for authenticity?
Well, I want to give an example. There's one that popped up when Francesca was talking about it. There was some time ago in which Eisner was the chairman, and there was a fairly public battle, which resulted in him leaving, and Iger was made the new CEO. Iger has a strong vision and a very well-grounded and strong personality. Steve had gone through an arc in his life, and he'd reached a point where he had a very strong ethical core. He'd become the kind of Steve that was going to be impactful in the world. But Bob said that he visited the theme parks and he found that almost all the new material at the theme parks came from Pixar films, and the Disney animation wasn't doing very well, and that it was broken, and that the leadership at Disney Animation said they had it about fixed, but he said he didn't believe them and he didn't know how to fix it. So he wanted to have discussions about buying Pixar because he knew that Pixar knew how to make films and that Disney didn't. So Steve came to me afterwards and he said he was blown away because Iger basically called him up and said, I have a really bad hand. Let's talk. And for Steve, it was this incredible sign of integrity that Bob wasn't just trying to pretend that something wasn't true. He just told him what his problem was. And that honesty led to a really close bonded friendship through the rest of Steve's life. And it came from the fact that Bob wasn't just saying, we'd like the reasons to buy us and so forth. He actually started off by saying, we're screwed. Let's talk. Now that's unusual, but it's powerful. And it proved to be very fruitful, but it started from that point of just honesty and humility and authenticity.
That is so interesting. It's a great example of how often we show authenticity through vulnerability. And it reminds me of what you did, Ed, at times when Pixar was growing in fast and people were coming in, and often they would sit in the rooms with the experienced directors and be silent because they didn't feel comfortable suggesting ideas. And you, if I'm correct, you started going to welcoming sessions and telling people about the many ways in which Pixar has screwed up in the past or made bad decisions, to sort of say, like any other organizations, we are not perfect and we need to hear from you, despite the fact that you might not have the experience under your belt that others in the organizations have. And it's this beautiful ability and willingness to put yourself out there with vulnerability. And again, we often think that that is bad for us, when in fact it allows us to connect much more deeply. Great story.
Well, and it's a tough issue because, I mean, to be honest, what I found was because I met with him fairly early on, they only listened to part of what I said. That the way most people work is they look at observed behavior. So here's a funny example of this. Early days of Pixar, there were a lot of jokesters, people racing scooters through the hallways or playing practical jokes. And then as the company got older, then those people that were the jokesters got married and they had kids. And so at night they went home. So now new people come into the company and they're told the stories. It's okay to do this. You don't get in trouble. And you give examples of all these weird, wild and wacky things that happen. So you can give all those examples, but what they see is that these people are actually going home at night. So they don't want to stand out. But there was something interesting about the fact that they made these assumptions because they were paying attention to what they saw more than what they heard. So that was their assumption, was they didn't want to look out of line. Now, they weren't saying this. This is what they're feeling, but they're not saying it. So it's not obvious that this is what's going on. It's just that they're not playing as many practical jokes as we used to. Meanwhile, the older people, the ones who's got the kids at home, they talk with themselves. They don't say anything to the new people about this. They talk about this problem and they say to each other, what's wrong with the new people? They have no sense of fun. So you basically have got these feelings which are unspoken, but that's true in organizations. It has to do with, gender and ethnicity or the way we work or power, or there are these unspoken assumptions. People feel like they don't feel comfortable saying them, and you have to keep looking out for them because they keep creeping back in. And over again, you'll find that stuff will happen and we won't know it. I won't know it. And all of a sudden you get surprised and you find there's a whole group of people who feel like they're second class. Well, how the hell did that happen? Because nobody's saying anything, but you can't address it. You have to pay attention to it. And you have to understand that a lot of the problems in the organization are things that aren't being talked about.
Is it possible to be a rebel and break the rules if you're not one of the leaders of an organization?
I am very curious to hear Ed's answer to this one.
The answer is yes. And I think in most groups, there are some people who push the boundaries. And if everybody pushed the boundaries, you probably couldn't get anything done. And by push the boundaries, I mean doing things a little weird or off base, whatever. The animation group, they used to have this event where with the new people, they'd have a party welcoming them and then they'd throw them in the pool. And so as I mentioned, after a notes day, we were meeting with the departments. And when I was meeting with the department, one of them referred to the fact that, well, we had to change what we were doing because of we were in trouble because of notes day. So we stopped our thing of throwing people in the pool. And I said, whoa, wait a minute. What do you mean you were in trouble? Yeah, we were in trouble because the police came on. You weren't in trouble. It was an illusion that was in their head. And it took 6 months to find out.
Does it feel like it's going to be a good climate in the near future for people who are rebel leaders and who think this way?
I think that given how much the world around us is changing, it is the perfect time to embrace this way of being a constructive rebel, suggesting ideas, being more open to the ideas of others, but also show curiosity in such a way that we just don't accept ways of working, but we keep on thinking about how is it that the work and how we approach this could be different. I can't think of a better time than now to think that way, the book came out 3 years ago, and so one could say ideas for the old world, and I would instead say let's embrace this way of thinking as we move forward.
We had this existential threat having to do with Sputnik, and there was I would say, an enlightened response, which led to ARPA, which then led to the computer revolution. And people put a lot of passion into it, and it was fairly massive in changing the world. The people who want to make a difference in the world are an incredible asset from around the world. We want to engage that asset, that passion, take the lessons we learned from the past, not about how to do things, but lessons about how to respond to change and how to create rapid learning environments, and to think in terms of rapid learning.
We often think of change as something that comes with a loss, and that often we need to just refocus our attentions to the fact that there is also an opportunity. And the opportunity is that we make whatever the problem is or the situation is actually better. And again, if I go back to some of the data that I collected with my colleagues over the last 15 months, the people and leaders who thrived the most across businesses were the one that, despite the fact that this crisis has been one that hurt a lot of people in so many ways, and definitely we didn't want that, but they looked at the crisis and say, where's the opportunity to do things differently, to come up with creative ideas, to be asking all sorts of questions that we weren't asking before. And so let's leverage that type of mindset and curiosity as we move forward.
We have the people to address that. And part of our challenge is to remove the barriers that get in that way of that happening. Can you approach it with intentionality? Can we go down a few layers and say, why was ARPA successful? Why were we able to respond quickly to the medical crisis of the pandemic? Why do some companies go belly up because they can't respond? And there are just too many companies that they're frozen because they can't conceive of what it means to do things in a new way. Mm-hmm. And not being able to conceive doesn't mean there isn't a new way. It just means you have to look hard and you have to experiment, and you have to think of the things that don't work as just things that don't work. They're not failures.
I go back to this idea of always thinking about, even in moments of accidents and mistake, what's the learning and what's the source of inspirations. One of the moments that I often bring into conversation, and it's a moment that I describe in the book that comes from this 3 Michelin star restaurant, was a moment where an accident happened. A tart dropped to the floor, very expensive dessert, but also it was the last of the night. Leaders could have reacted in many different ways, and the way Bottura decided to react is looking at this smashed tart on the floor and thinking of it as the source of inspiration for a new dessert that is in fact now conceived as a deconstructed lemon tart and is now the most popular dessert at the restaurant. And the name for it is Oops, I Dropped the Lemon Tart. And so how do we think that way, develop that type of thinking, and hold on to that type of thinking where even in the most constrained situations, or even in the face of a mistake or an accident, we turn that into a source of inspiration and the potential for good change.
Well, Francesca, Gino, author of Rebel Talent, Why It Pays to Break the Rules at Work and in Life. Ed Catmull, founder of Pixar and former president of both Pixar and Disney. Thank you both for this really timely discussion, and thank you for the very timely book, Francesca. I think it was a great read, and I hope so many people pick it up and think about the next months and years ahead.
Thank you so much
My
for
pleasure.
having us.
Rebel Talent is available for purchase at the Novel Neighbor.